12 hours, that's how long I spent cramped in an airplane seat, watching movies I'd already seen, drinking terrible coffee, and counting down the minutes until I could see my mother again. 12 hours of turbulence over the Atlantic, of delayed connections, of dragging my suitcase through 3 different airports, but it would all be worth it the moment I saw her face. My name is Sophia, and I'm 27 years old. I'd been living in New York for the past 3 years, building my career as a marketing consultant, working 60-hour weeks, and somehow always finding excuses not to visit home. Home was a small coastal town in Portugal where my mother, Beatriz, had lived her entire life. The same house where I'd grown up, where she'd raised me alone after my father died when I was 12. We talked every week on video calls, but it had been almost 2 years since I'd seen her in person. 2 years of promises to visit soon, of plane tickets I'd looked at but never bought, of letting work and life and everything else take priority over the woman who'd sacrificed everything for me. But 3 weeks ago, something changed. Maybe it was the way her voice sounded tired during our last call, or the way she'd mentioned feeling lonely more often lately. Maybe it was guilt finally catching up with me. Or maybe it was just time. I booked the flight without telling her. I wanted it to be a surprise. I could already picture her face when she opened the door, the shock, the joy, the way she'd pull me into one of her crushing hugs that always made everything feel okay again. The plane landed in Lisbon at 6 in the morning local time. I caught the first train to Vila do Mar, my hometown, watching the familiar countryside roll past the windows. Everything looked exactly the same, the olive groves, the stone walls, the red-tiled roofs. It was like stepping back in time. By 9:30, I was standing at the end of Rua das Flores, looking down at the narrow cobblestone street where I'd grown up. Our house, my mother's house, was the third one from the corner, painted the same soft yellow it had been since I was a child. The bougainvillea was still climbing over the front wall, just as wild and beautiful as I remembered. My heart was racing as I walked up to the familiar blue door. The brass knocker was the same one my father had installed 30 years ago, shaped like a nautical anchor. I could hear my mother moving around inside, the sound of footsteps, maybe the television playing quietly. I raised my hand to knock, smiling to myself as I imagined her surprise. This was going to be perfect. The door opened and my smile died on my face. A man stood there, a stranger. He was maybe 50 years old, with graying hair and kind eyes, wearing a bathrobe and holding a cup of coffee. He looked at me with polite confusion, the way you look at someone who's clearly knocked on the wrong door. "Bom dia," he said pleasantly. "Can I help you?" I stared at him, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. This wasn't my mother, this wasn't even a woman. This was a complete stranger, standing in my mother's doorway, holding coffee in my mother's kitchen. "I'm sorry," I managed to say in Portuguese, my voice sounding strange and distant. "I think I have the wrong address." But even as I said it, I knew I didn't. This was 47 Rua das Flores. This was the house where I'd taken my first steps, where I'd learned to ride a bicycle, where my mother had held me while I cried over my first heartbreak. The blue door, the anchor knocker, the bougainvillea, everything was exactly the same except for the man standing in front of me. "Are you looking for someone in particular?" he asked, tilting his head. "Beatriz," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Beatriz Santos, she lives here." The man's expression changed, not to recognition, but to something that looked almost like pity. "I'm sorry," he said gently. "No one by that name lives here. I live here. My name is Miguel." "No," I said, shaking my head. "No, that's not right. My mother lives here, Beatriz Santos. She's lived here for over 30 years. Miguel looked at me more carefully, and I could see him taking in my appearance, the suitcase beside me, the exhaustion on my face, the growing panic in my eyes. "How long since you've been here?" he asked softly. 2 years, I admitted, "but we talk every week. She lives here. This is her house." Miguel was quiet for a long moment, and something in his silence made my stomach drop. "Would you like to come in?" he offered. "I think we should talk." Every instinct told me to run, to get back on the train, get back on the plane, pretend this never happened, but I needed answers. I needed to know where my mother was and how this stranger had ended up in her house. I followed Miguel inside, and the familiar became foreign all at once. The layout was the same, the narrow hallway, the stairs leading up to the bedrooms, the living room that opened onto the tiny kitchen. But everything else was different. The furniture was wrong. The pictures on the walls were of people I didn't recognize. The smell was wrong, masculine cologne instead of my mother's lavender soap. "Please sit down," Miguel said, gesturing to a couch that definitely wasn't the faded floral one I remembered. "Can I get you some coffee, water?" I shook my head, perching on the edge of the couch like I might need to bolt at any moment. "Where is my mother?" Miguel sat across from me, his coffee cup cradled in his hands. I bought this house 8 months ago, he said carefully. From the bank, it was a foreclosure. The word hit me like a physical blow. Foreclosure. The previous owner had fallen behind on payments. The bank took possession and put it up for auction. I'm sorry, I had no idea there was family who didn't know. My mind was reeling, but that's impossible. My mother would never let that happen. She would have called me, she would have asked for help. Miguel's expression grew even more sympathetic. What was your mother's full name, and when did you last speak to her? Beatriz Santos. And we talked last Sunday. We talk every Sunday. On the phone. Video call. We always do video calls. Miguel was quiet for a moment, then pulled out his phone. I'm going to show you something, but I want you to prepare yourself. He handed me the phone, and I found myself looking at a real estate listing. The photos showed this house, my mother's house, but completely empty. Bare walls, no furniture, clearly abandoned. This is from 9 months ago, Miguel said gently, when the bank first listed it. I scrolled through the photos, my hands shaking. Every room was empty. Not just cleared out for sale, abandoned, like no one had lived there in months. I don't understand, I whispered. We video call every week. I see her in the house. I see the living room behind her. Sophia, Miguel said, and I realized I must have told him my name at some point. When you video call with your mother, where does she say she is? At home. She's always at home. And what do you see behind her? I tried to remember our last call, my mother's face on the screen, smiling and asking about my work. Behind her was what? I'd been so focused on her face, on our conversation, that I'd barely paid attention to the background. The living room, I said uncertainly. I see the living room. But as I said it, I realized how vague my memory was. I couldn't remember specific details about what was behind her. I couldn't remember seeing our old couch or the family photos that had hung on the walls. Is it possible, Miguel asked very gently, that your mother has been calling you from somewhere else? Maybe she didn't want you to worry, so she didn't tell you she'd moved. I wanted to argue with him, to insist that he was wrong, but the evidence was right in front of me. This house had been empty for 9 months. My mother hadn't lived here for almost a year. Do you know where she went? I asked desperately. The neighbors, did any of them know where she moved? Miguel's expression grew uncomfortable. I asked around when I was thinking about buying the place, getting a feel for the neighborhood, you know. The woman next door, Senora Carvalho, I think she said the previous owner just disappeared one day. Left in the middle of the night with a suitcase, leaving everything behind. That's not possible. My mother would never just leave everything behind. Maybe she was in some kind of trouble. Financial trouble or... He didn't finish the sentence, but I could guess what he was thinking. Maybe she was running from something. Maybe she had debts or problems I didn't know about. I need to talk to Senora Carvalho, I said, standing up abruptly. She might know more. Miguel nodded. She's probably home. She's retired, rarely goes out. The house with the green shutters right next door. I thanked him and rushed outside, my mind spinning with questions and growing dread. Senora Carvalho had been our neighbor my entire life. If anyone knew what had happened to my mother, it would be her. I knocked on the green door, and after a few minutes it opened to reveal a familiar face. Senora Carvalho was smaller and more frail than I remembered, but her eyes were still sharp. Sophia, she said, looking shocked. Meu Deus, what are you doing here? Senora Carvalho, I need to ask you about my mother. About what happened to her. The old woman's face crumpled. Oh, child, come in, we need to talk. Her living room was exactly as I remembered, dark wooden furniture, religious pictures on the walls, the smell of old books and cooking oil. She made me sit down and brought me a glass of water I didn't want. Your mother, she began, then stopped. Sophia, how long since you talked to her? Last Sunday. We talk every week. Senora Carvalho stared at me. That's not possible, child. What do you mean? Sophia, she took my hands in her gnarled ones. Your mother died 4 months ago. The world stopped. Everything went silent, except for the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. No, I said, no, that's not true. I talked to her last Sunday. We video called. She asked about my work, told me about her garden. Child, I was at her funeral. I helped organize it. We waited for you, but no one knew how to reach you. Your mother never gave anyone your contact information. I pulled my hands away from hers, standing up so quickly that I knocked over the water glass. You're lying, you're confused. I talked to her last Sunday, but even as I said it, pieces were clicking into place. The way my mother's image sometimes pixelated during our calls, the way her voice occasionally had an odd echo. The way she never seemed to react when I moved around my apartment during our conversations. How? I whispered. How did she die? Cancer, Senora Carvalho said softly. She'd been sick for over a year, but she didn't tell anyone until it was too late. By the time she went to the hospital, there was nothing they could do. She would have told me. She would have called me. She made me promise not to contact you. She said you had your own life, that she didn't want to be a burden. She was so proud of your success in America. New York, I corrected automatically. I live in New York. Senora Carvalho nodded. She talked about you all the time, about your job, your apartment, how well you were doing, but she said you were too busy for an old woman's problems. I felt like I was going to be sick. The calls, if she's dead, then who have I been talking to? The old woman looked confused. What calls, child? I pulled out my phone with shaking hands and showed her the call log. Every Sunday for the past 4 months, regular video calls with the contact labeled me. Senora Carvalho put on her reading glasses and studied the screen. This number, she said slowly. This isn't your mother's number. What do you mean? Your mother's phone was disconnected when she couldn't pay the bill. That was months before she died. I stared at the number on my screen. I'd been calling it every week for months, thinking I was talking to my mother. But if this wasn't her number, then who had been answering? I need to call this number, I said, right now. Sophia, maybe you should. But I was already dialing. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times, then someone picked up. Allah, Sophia, said a voice I knew as well as my own. My mother's voice, exactly the way I'd been hearing it every Sunday for months. Who is this? I demanded, my voice shaking with rage and fear. There was a pause, then, this is your cousin Anna. Anna, my mother's niece, who lived in Lisbon. I'd met her a handful of times over the years, but we'd never been close. Anna, what the hell is going on? Where is my mother? Another pause. Sophia, your mother is dead. She died 4 months ago. Then who have I been talking to? Me, Anna said quietly. I've been pretending to be her. The phone slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor. Senora Carvalho picked it up, but I couldn't hear what Anna was saying anymore. The ringing in my ears was too loud. I had been talking to my cousin. For 4 months, I had been having weekly conversations with someone who was pretending to be my dead mother. Someone who had been lying to me, letting me believe my mother was alive and well while she rotted in a grave I'd never even visited. Why? I managed to ask when Senora Carvalho handed the phone back to me. Because your mother made me promise, Anna said, and I could hear that she was crying now. She made me promise that you would never know how bad things got. How sick she was, how scared she was, how much debt she was in. She said you had your own life and she didn't want to destroy it with her problems. So you've been lying to me for 4 months. I've been protecting you just like she asked me to. She recorded hours of video messages before she died, talking about different things, different scenarios. I've been editing them together, making it look like we were having real conversations. I felt like I was in a nightmare. Editing them together. Basic video editing software. I would take your questions from our real video calls and match them with her pre-recorded responses. Sometimes I had to use AI voice generation to fill in gaps to make her responses more natural. AI voice generation. Technology has gotten very sophisticated, Sophia. I could make her say anything, make it look like she was responding to you in real time. I was going to be sick. For months, I'd been pouring my heart out to what I thought was my mother, telling her about my life, my problems, my hopes. And all along, it had been an elaborate lie constructed from old video clips and artificial intelligence. She's really dead, I whispered. She's really dead. I'm so sorry, Sophia. I know this is horrible, but your mother made me promise. She said if you knew the truth, you'd come home and give up everything you'd worked for. She said your life was more important than her death. I hung up the phone and sat in Senora Carvalho's living room, staring at the wall. My mother had been dead for 4 months. 4 months during which I'd been living in blissful ignorance, thinking she was safe and happy at home, when really she was dying alone and afraid. She was so proud of you, Senora Carvalho said softly. Even at the end, she talked about how successful you were, how you didn't need to worry about her problems. I should have been here, I said. I should have known. She didn't want you to know. She was protecting you the only way she knew how. But it didn't feel like protection. It felt like theft. Anna and my mother had stolen my chance to say goodbye, to be there during her final months to help her through her illness. They'd decided that my career was more important than her life, and they'd made that choice without asking me. I spent the next 3 days in Vila do Mar, staying in a small hotel and trying to piece together the truth of my mother's final year. I talked to neighbors, to her doctor, to the priest who had performed her funeral. Slowly, a picture emerged of a woman who had been struggling far more than I'd ever realized. The cancer diagnosis had come with devastating medical bills. She'd mortgaged the house to pay for treatments that ultimately didn't work. She'd been alone, scared, and dying, while I was in New York complaining about my job and dating the wrong men. I visited her grave on my last day there. It was a simple stone marker in the local cemetery, with her name and the dates of her birth and death. No epitaph, no fancy flowers, just the basic dignity that was all she could afford. I sat there for hours, talking to her the way I'd been talking to her for months, except this time I knew she couldn't hear me. I told her I was sorry for not coming sooner, for not insisting on visiting, for letting work and life keep me away from the person who mattered most. I told her I forgave her for the lie, even though I wasn't sure I meant it yet. When I flew back to New York, I carried with me a box of her belongings that Senora Carvalho had saved, some jewelry, photo albums, letters I'd written her over the years that she'd kept. It wasn't much, but it was all that remained of a life that had ended without me even knowing. I never spoke to Anna again. I blocked her number and deleted all record of our conversations. I couldn't forgive her for the deception, even though I understood why she'd done it. My mother's death was devastating enough without the added betrayal of learning that my grief had been artificially delayed by months. I quit my job in New York and moved back to Portugal 6 months later. Not to Vila do Mar, there were too many ghosts there, but to Lisbon, where I could start over while still being close to home. I started my own consulting business, something that would have made my mother proud. I bought Miguel's house back from him at a significant loss. He was understanding about it, had even kept some of my mother's belongings that had been left behind when the bank foreclosed. I renovated it completely, making it mine rather than trying to recreate what it had been when my mother lived there. But I kept the blue door and the anchor knocker because some things are worth preserving. I think about Anna's deception often, and I've come to understand it as both an act of love and an act of cruelty. Love, because she was honoring my mother's wishes and trying to spare me pain. Cruelty, because she robbed me of the chance to be present for the most important goodbye of my life. I think about the conversations I had with my mother during those 4 months and how real they felt at the time. The technology that made it possible is both fascinating and terrifying. The idea that we can now manufacture the presence of the dead, that grief can be postponed indefinitely through careful editing and artificial intelligence. But in the end, no amount of technology can replace the truth. No elaborate deception, however well-intentioned, can substitute for authentic human connection. Anna gave me 4 more months of thinking my mother was alive, but she took away my chance to help her die with dignity and love. I still don't know if I would have made the same choice my mother did, if I would have hidden my illness to protect someone I loved, or if I would have asked for help and risked burdening them with my problems. I hope I never have to find out. What I do know is that when I care about someone now, I don't just tell them during weekly phone calls. I show up, I visit, I make sure they know that no problem is too big, no burden too heavy for the people who love them to share. Because the worst thing isn't watching someone you love suffer. The worst thing is learning they suffered alone because they thought you were too busy to care. If you're watching this and you have family members you haven't seen in too long, people you keep meaning to visit but never quite make time for, please don't wait. Don't assume that weekly phone calls are enough, that good intentions can substitute for presence. The stranger at my mother's door wasn't the real betrayal. The real betrayal was all the times I chose convenience over connection, all the visits